I tried to breathe and I drowned. The roar of the ocean is gone. It's just peaceful in this vast darkness, but I was comfortable. I was mesmerized by it. As I got closer, I saw that it was millions of lights, and they were all moving together in unison. I started feeling like I was being wrapped in this love. And then 3 fragments broke away, and they came toward me, and they were greeting me, and they were welcoming me home. And then the light itself spoke to me, and it said, "This is not your time. You must return." And I said, "No way. I am not going back." The light spoke one more time, and this time it said, "You must return. You have a purpose." It was in 1983 that I was the chief engineer of a research vessel, and we were trying to bring our ship in, but there was a storm, a very violent storm, go ashore so they could catch a plane. There was some urgent need for them to return. So we put a small rubber Zodiac in the water to bring them in. We use it to retrieve our submarines and things like that. So we were used to, rough seas, and we were used to all that. So we weren't overly concerned. But it was 25 to 30 foot seas. It's pretty rough. But we would ride up on top of the swell, take a bearing on the harbor buoy, and then we'd run the trough and go up on the next swell and do it all over again. But the storm was and the wind was blowing, it was dark, it was raining. We lost track of the harbor buoy, but we figured we would just do a beach landing and get this guy in so that he could get to the airport. But we didn't realize that the storm had blown us almost a mile south of the harbor, and about a mile from the coast, we actually hit a breaker zone, and we drove right off of one of the waves. Actually, caught air, and I yelled to the mate to turn us around, and he started to turn us around. I was in the bow trying to navigate, and the next one hit, and it folded that Zodiac in half like a peanut butter sandwich. It just folded it in half, and I was in the bow, so it catapulted me right into the water. But I had a life vest on, and I wasn't overly concerned. I'm trained as a commercial diver, so I've spent lots of time in the water. wasn't overly concerned, but I was being tumbled and tossed like a rag doll and totally lost my orientation as to what was up and what was down. So I had the presence of mind not to try to swim, because I could be swimming down, making things worse. So I just hung on to the life vest, tried to protect myself as best I could as I was being, pushed around by wave after wave. And, you can only hold your breath so long. And eventually, the euphoria of oxygen deprivation and all of that overcame me, and I tried to breathe, and I drowned. But I found myself immediately in this vast darkness. Now, I know for some people this could sound frightening, but it really wasn't, because I had just come from this very violent environment into this calm, this peace. And I didn't really feel alone. It felt like I was in the presence of something greater, but it was absolute darkness. But I was comfortable. On the west coast of the United States, the water comes from the north. It's very cold, and this was in March, so it was very cold. Suddenly, I'm no longer cold. I'm very comfortable. I don't, and the roar of the ocean is gone. It's just peaceful. And so I was curious. I was very curious. It didn't frighten me at all. I was just very curious. And that's when I started to see this. Just at the beginning, it was just this little speck of light, but it caught my attention. And as I looked at it, it felt like I started moving toward it, or it was moving toward me. And I was mesmerized by it. I just, was staring at it. And as I got closer, I saw that it was not just one light, but millions of lights, fragments of light, and they were all moving together in unison. It was quite beautiful, all different colors and hues, and it was like they were of one mind, because if you've ever seen a flock of birds that fly together and they all kind of swoop in unison, it was very much like that, only infinite. It was just millions upon millions of this. And as I started getting closer, I started feeling like I was being wrapped in this love. It's kind of hard to explain, because we think of love as an emotion, but it was more, this was actually felt like my whole being was being permeated by this love. This love was just encapsulating me, and it was like a warm embrace. And so I kept coming closer and closer, and I was in just absolute awe of what I was experiencing. And then 3 fragments broke away, and they came toward me, and they were greeting me, and they were welcoming me home. And I still get emotional over it because I'd never felt anything like that before. I grew up my mother was a single mother, and she was trying to make her way in life, but she would place me with these families to try to, she thought she was doing a good thing for me to put me with a family, but she didn't realize that one family after another, it was either neglect or abuse or this and that. And so I never really had a sense of family, and to have people welcoming me home was just an amazing feeling for me, to be wrapped in this love, feeling welcomed. And eventually there were a dozen of them that came and were greeting me and welcoming me home. It was incredible, an incredible experience for me, one that I live with every day, that I will never, ever forget meeting. And I call them my soul family. And we went further into the light, into this area. To me, it felt like a giant bubble, a sphere. And we went in there and we started to re-experience my life. And I say we because not only was I reliving my life, but my soul family was reliving my life at the same time. And it wasn't just me watching my life. It was reliving it, but not only through my perspective, but everyone I'd ever interacted with through their experiences. So it was like my consciousness fragmented into these. And so I got to feel what they felt when I interacted with them. And I was a brash young man, and I had because of my growing up and not feeling like I belonged, I had a pretty harsh reality that I felt like the only way you make it through life is you survive and you cut your swath through life. And that's a pretty brutal philosophy, and it doesn't really take other people into consideration. It's very much a survivalist, lone person type of philosophy. So to relive my life and to see myself acting this way with others was incredibly eye-opening for me and incredibly humbling, to the fact that I really didn't want my soul family to experience this. There were some things that I was very harsh with, and I didn't want them to experience that. But they didn't judge me. They didn't judge me at all. In fact, they supported me. They loved me, and we went through my life. Eventually, we came to a point where it wasn't anything that I had lived, and it was a little disorienting because I didn't have any reference to what I was experiencing, to what I was seeing and living. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually previewing my potential future life. And everything in the life review up to that point was very crystal clear, absolutely clear. All the different points of focus, everything was crystal clear. But the minute we crossed that, like a corridor that was very clear, but then on the periphery, it was a little out of focus. But I got the feeling that if I wanted to, I could go a little bit this way. But I would always have that core path available to me. And so I went through this, and I experienced a number of events. And then the light itself spoke to me. These millions upon millions of fragments of light, all at once, in unison, spoke, and it said, "This is not your time. You must return." And I said, "No way. I am not going back. I've got a family that loves me here. I feel supported and loved like I've never felt before in my life." And I argued what I perceived as God. But the light spoke one more time. And this time it said, "You must return. You have a purpose." And that word purpose just really resonated with me. When we're on the other side, we're not so confined by our physical presence like we are here. We have the ability to connect with a greater consciousness. I like to say it's like we're connected to all the souls that ever were and all the souls that ever will be. And so we have this expansive awareness that we find it difficult to tap into here. And so with that expanded awareness, I was able to understand that purpose. It was very clear. It was simple. It was efficient. With that clarity, I came to acceptance. I accepted that, yes, I have this purpose. And with that, the moment I came to acceptance, I found myself back outside my body. Now I'm watching it. It's still in the water, being tumbled, had gotten caught in that cyclical area where the waves are. And I'm watching it, and I'm curious. I'm like, how is the enormity of me, because I realized I had transitioned into this light being of myself, how is the enormity of me going to fit in there, into that dense body, you know? But a bow line from the zodiac, my body came close to the wreckage of the zodiac, and we were kind of trapped in these waves. It had wrapped itself around my arm, and the bitter end of the bow line was tapping my lifeless chest. And I was just observing this. And another set of waves came, and when it did, it popped up the wreckage, and when it did, it cinched around my arm and pulled me up, and pulled my body up to the surface. I was just observing this. Myself and three of my soul family were with me, and we were just observing my body going through all this. And some more waves hit my body, and were just pushing it up against the wreckage. And when it did, it pushed some of that salt water up, and I was able to take a breath. When I took a breath, that's when my soul family gave me a gentle push, and I found myself going back into my body. It's kind of funny, you know, when we come back from something like that, it's like we're half here and half there, and we feel like that expanded awareness was still with me. And I was aware that because I was having trouble staying up. And now I'm a commercial diver and a lot of times in the water. So, I mean, I shouldn't be having difficulty staying up. But when the line pulled on my arm, it dislocated my shoulder and dislocated this thumb. But the water was so cold that everything was numb. I didn't, it just wasn't working. It was kind of funny. But so I was trying to hang on to the wreckage of the zodiac, and I was trying to stay up, but I kept sinking down. And the waves were still, battering us. But the other guys, and I'm trying to expel as much salt water and trying to, get my bearing. And the other guys were looking for me. They're the heroes in my story, because they had stayed in this dangerous zone, this breaker zone, looking for me. And so they found me, and then we all swam that last mile into the beach. It's something that it's kind of funny, because the purpose seemed so clear when I was on the other side, but I had that greater awareness. And then as I came into my body, it's like it was like sand in my hand. It was slipping through my fingers, and I couldn't keep a hold of the purpose. And so all the time we were swimming into shore, I was like, purpose, what was that purpose, and trying to hold on to the vision, but it totally slipped away. And so it left me wanting. It left me with this feeling of, what was that? What just happened to me? And, that love, I want that love in my life. How do I, so there's all these questions when you come back from an experience like this of what was it? Am I crazy? How do I find what I had on the other side? And how can I bring it into this life? That sort of thing. So those are the type of questions that I had right away. And it took a while, but I say fortunately, but at the time I wasn't real happy about coming back. And I wasn't real happy about how it changed me, how it altered me, because suddenly I could see auras. I didn't even know what an aura was. I'd never really heard about it and definitely hadn't experienced it before, but I could see auras in people and plants and things. And it kind of freaked me out. It was like, what is this? And I thought, oh my gosh, is there something wrong with me or something? I just called them life force energies because I didn't really have a name for them. And not only that, but I started getting these intuitive knowings. These understandings would come to me. And it wasn't something that I'd studied in school. It wasn't something that I'd experienced in life. And I didn't trust it because I didn't know where it came from. And so as an engineer, I started testing it to see how real, how veridic is this information. And I found it was incredibly trustworthy. So over time, I began to rely on this communication, this extra communication that suddenly I was able to have. But the experience itself scared me. Yeah, I know, I was this adrenaline junkie diver guy that, big macho guy, but the experience really, really shook me. And so I had never heard of anything like it. So I was just, who gets to argue with God? Not me. It's like I'm not worthy of that. So it kind of frightened me. So I thought, I just want to get my old life back. I want to get back on track. But the experience doesn't let you do that. It really doesn't. It stays with you. And it becomes kind of your scale in life. As you go through life, we like to measure, how are we doing? Well, now that I've had this life review and I've met my soul family and everything, and I saw how my interactions actually do affect change, do affect others, that I need to be more responsible. And so I started changing the things that I could accept. I didn't want to think about the soul family. The love was something that I did want to try to find. And so I became a voracious reader looking for, love and how can I have that, that total immersive type of love that's, there's no words here and to describe how that love, really felt.
Have you come close to finding it?
I can touch it now because I've learned how to go back to the light. And I use it in my healing practice because later in life I've developed lung cancer that metastasized into my spine. It ate away 2.5 bones of my thoracic. And so during that process, well, actually prior to that, I met a mentor, another experiencer who helped me to realize that, no, you're not crazy. This is a real thing that you experienced. And so having someone to talk to is incredibly helpful in integrating these types of experiences, or either an individual or a group or a retreat or something that is, focused on the type of experience you've had is so incredibly helpful. And it helped me. It helped me to come to terms with it, to accept it, and to integrate it. But yeah, it was a trial. There's a lot of challenges. There's some misconceptions out there because, in the movies they make it sound like, oh, you have this beautiful experience and life is wonderful afterwards. Well, you have to learn to live with it afterwards. And that's hard. That's difficult, And so you have these challenges, but it's nice to have someone to talk to, someone that has gone through it or been there.
Absolutely. And it's what I hear a lot, especially sometimes we'll have people in the comments that have had similar experiences, and they come to these types of videos because in their surroundings, in their, family or circle of friends, people don't believe that, they don't understand it. And often enough, people, when they don't understand or believe something, they tend to also be, here you are having a transformative experience, and when you're sharing it, you're just met with resistance and denial. And I can definitely see how, especially this being a very unique type of experience, you're sort of trying to integrate it yourself. So when everybody else around you is doubtful, then at least for me, I know that I would start doubting myself if everybody was telling me, well, you're probably just hallucinating, you probably just dreamt it and you imagined it.
I got very good at hiding it because I was with a group of people that knew, they told me, they said, look, Dave, you were gone for a good 8 to 10 minutes maybe. And nobody can hold their breath that long, and so I got good at hiding it. I would say things like, oh, Neptune spit me back and things like that. I just didn't go into it because the work that we did was commercial underwater research. And so it was very dangerous back in the 80s, that type of work. And so we put each other's lives in each other's hands all the time. And so death was just a taboo subject. So I got very good at hiding the experience itself. Because the first person I did try to share it with, I had a very bad experience. They just, they didn't believe. And so that, and they discounted, and so that just told me, oh, I can't share this. And until I found another experiencer. But yeah, so I can understand what you're talking about, not trusting. You have to find someone that you feel is going to listen, because listening is the therapy. It really is. The quality of being a good friend is that you can listen, and you can allow an experiencer to share the experience without interrupting or without interpreting. When someone tries to interpret another experiencer's experience, you're taking them off course. It's for them. The journey of integration is a personal experience as well. And for someone to try to tell you what your experience was isn't fair. It just isn't fair.
You said one thing that really resonated with me, and I really believe in synchronicities, and incidentally, it's something that I've heard a few days ago as well. And that is that part of you stayed on the other side, and just part of you is here. And when you were integrating that experience, you had to process that as well. Now, what I was told a few days back was that all of us have a presence on the other side, and that what is here and what we perceive to be ourselves is actually just a fragment of who we truly are, and the rest of us just lives on that other side. Now, could you get more into how that played out for you and why you're saying you had this feeling?
Yeah, these awareness doesn't happen right away. It takes some time to really understand what is happening, because when you come back, you feel like, oh my gosh, now you start to live in this state of duality, where you know that you are a spiritual being, but you also know in this physical life. And now you feel separated from your divine nature. But as you start to explore that, once you understand you do have a divine nature, and you start to explore it, then you find that, yes, there's a small percentage of that divinity that resides within us in this physical form. But the greater totality of our being resides in the light. It's one of those fragments of light. And so, but the part that's within us is connected. It's connected to that. And so when we can quiet our mind enough to, and be still, we can connect to that greater divinity. I was fortunate to find a mentor that kind of showed me that we can touch that divine sense within us. And through that, we can connect with our greater total self. And so that's when, and so this is now my reality, now that I can do that. And so that really changed things even more. In fact, it created more transformative experiences, because if you cross that threshold into your divine nature, it's very spiritual in its composition. And so you tend to bring that into your life. And so now you're taking your true self, your true nature, and you're trying to live your life with that. And so what that does is it helps you to raise your awareness above the circumstances that you find yourself in. Most of the time we just allow ourselves to get swept up into the circumstances that are going on either in our life, in our world, in our, our community, our family, and we get caught up in that. We get caught up in the drama. We get caught up in just the happenings that are going on around us. And so our awareness resides in the circumstances. But when we can take a step back, take a deep breath, and allow our awareness to just rise just slightly above the circumstances, that's where we have a clarity of vision. That's where we have the ability to make empowering choices. And to be able to, if we're not satisfied with where we find ourselves, we can see the pathway to lead ourselves into something better.
Beautiful. And if we wanted to connect to that power within ourselves, How could we do that?
I'm a firm believer in developing a spiritual practice. The more, a lot of times right now people are moving away from spirituality. They're moving away from religion. They're moving away from spirituality. I feel that it's a sad thing, because when we move toward a spiritual practice, when we, and I don't dictate one belief over another. I found that, there's a pathway up the mountain from many directions. And so I really believe that the first thing is to try to find something that resonates with your heart. When you find a spiritual practice that feels like your heart is expanding, or you feel like you're lighter than you were before, then you found a practice that can help you. I'm a firm believer in meditation. I believe that through meditation we can quiet our minds enough that we can begin to hear that divine nature. We begin to sense. Now, it may come in many different forms. Some people may feel just a sense of lightness, may see the light, but others will, be able to get insight, some inspiration. Another tool that I think is great for connecting to your higher self is through inspiration. We all have something that inspires us. We all have something that whether it's writing or something that brings us inspiration. Think about that for a minute. Where does inspiration come from? It comes from our divine nature. It's our connection to our greater self. So when we can work with our inspiration and allow ourselves, because that's another way of meditating in many ways, when we totally involve ourselves in the activities that help us to be inspired, that's when we are communicating. We are starting to touch that greater sense for ourselves. I used to, when I came back and I was trying through my integration phases, I found jewelry and stuff like that, and while I was doing that, inspiration was coming and showing me different things that I could do. I didn't go and read a book on how to do silversmithing. I allowed my inspiration to teach me, and so it showed. I would get visions and things like that. Eventually, I was able to discern what was that chattery mind and what was my true nature. And I noticed right away that when I'm feeling inspiration, I usually feel it. Now, I know some people feel it in their hands, in the top of their head, maybe their crown. I have some healer friends that feel it in their hands. Myself, I feel it in my heart. It feels like my heart is just expanding. And so along with the inspiration, many times there's a physical sensation, and that can be a clue. That can help us to recognize when it's inspiration, when it's our divine nature that's talking to us, and it's not just the chattery mind that's always. And another clue is the chattery mind is very critical, very judgmental. It's but our divine nature is very matter of fact, very loving, very just straight on, and it doesn't have those critical components. It doesn't have that judgment. It doesn't have, it's not criticizing. So it's an easy way to recognize which is our divine nature and which is just our chattery mind, because we're human. We all have chattery minds.
I love that. And speaking of meditation, I know that you've had quite an interesting experience in one of your meditations. Could you share more about that? That
was a turning point in my spiritual journey, because I had started connecting with others, not so much other experiencers, but just spiritual groups. I was in that phase where I really was trying to find what's my spiritual base, that sort of thing. And so I was with a group that wanted to do a meditation, and in the meditation, I heard the light. And it said, return to the light. And I actually relived my near-death experience in a meditation. But it was so hyper-real that in the life review, I actually saw, because this experience happened 11 years after the initial near-death experience. And I got to see how much I had changed in 11 years. And that really helped me to come to grips with, I had just cherry-picked some of the better parts of the experience, and I didn't really integrate the totality of it, of the soul family, of the light itself. And I realized that I wasn't being truthful to myself, and truth is a really key element in my life. And so when I realized that I had kind of suppressed part of the experience just so that I could get on in life because I was having so much trouble dealing with it, that was liberating. And so that's when I realized I have to live by what I'd learned in these experiences, these spiritual experiences. And it allowed me kind of a freedom to be able to express myself more openly, okay? Because I'd been hiding. I mentioned I got really good at hiding. So I've been hiding my spiritual nature, because I was afraid people would judge me. But then I realized, if I'm being authentic, if I want to be an authentic individual and I want to live my life with truth, then I need to allow myself to be, and allowing is a huge, huge method of living, okay, is allowing yourself to be who you are, to be authentic. A lot of times we tend to cloak ourselves in these personas that we want people to see us this way or see us that way. And we may have 2 or 3 different cloaks that we put on and take off all the time. But it's so liberating when we can just cast those away, those personas away, and just be real, be ourselves. And so that's what that meditation really showed me, was that, and I called it my quiet ministry afterwards. It was that I am going to live by what I'd learned in these experiences, and I was going to try to be as authentic as possible.
It's quite amazing, and especially thinking of your background. So you're an engineer, really into science. I mean, a person of science, right? Believing that everything we know needs to be proven. Also having this really tough job, so you have to have a thick skin because you're putting yourself on the line every day. Not everybody would be able to do that, as well as based on your upbringing. I'm picking up that you had to learn to be very individualistic and look out for yourself because there weren't many other people to look out for you. So it's almost like I'm describing the opposite of somebody who's spiritual, right?
Exactly. It's Sabrina, you're right on target there. It was a new worldview for me but it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while. That's why I keep talking about integration, is because it takes time. It's not like you flick a switch. And it's the same thing with humanity. Humanity is growing. You look around the world and you think, oh, I don't think we're growing at all. But we are, because we're talking about these subjects openly. And when I first had the experience, nobody talked about it openly. It was so unpopular. But you're right, there are still many, many people that don't hear about it, or don't believe it because they haven't experienced it. But it's shows like this, your podcast, that kind of allow people to see it, allow people to see, well, he's a real guy. He's an engineer, and he had this experience. It altered his life, and it altered his life's course. And that these things happen to real people from all walks of life. And so getting that message out helps every other experiencer down the road, the people that are going to have the experience. Now they have something to go to. When I had my experience, I didn't have anything to go to. I didn't have, and it was like a desert for me, and I felt all alone. But now because of speaking on podcasts, I have my own podcast where I talk about how to live more of a contemplative lifestyle, where you commune with your true nature. And that is, I'm finding that I speak to a lot of people online, and we're all searching for that. We're all searching for our divine nature. We're all really, really want to know who we are, and we want to know our relationship with God or Source or Goddess, whatever you may call it. We're all searching for that.
Absolutely. And on your note of not having the vocabulary and not knowing back then what just happened, one of the interviews I did was with Gary Wimmer, and he's had his experience in 73, I believe. So again, you had no idea what had happened. He was hit by a car. By all logic, he shouldn't have survived, but he... And the interesting part was this man gets hit by a car. He is able to just stand up and walk away, and he's being taken to the hospital to get a psychiatric evaluation, which I guess it's quite normal. But then he had to go to jail because because nothing happened to him. So just because he had this story of, I was taken by these monitors, they showed me what was going to happen with Earth, and then I saw my own future. And he was very, I found it quite impressive that he wouldn't change his story just to please people. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, would have just said, what other people wanted to hear, just to get out of that situation. So he was taken into jail because they just couldn't comprehend what happened to him. And by no means, he was a musician. He had no legal training whatsoever. But he started talking to the other inmates and giving them legal advice on their cases, which was really accurate and helpful. So that was, quite an interesting story, and a really strong person as well to not change his story in the face of adversity.
Yeah, well, the experiences themselves feel more real than this life. So it's you can't discount it, and I live with it every day. It's as clear today as it was the day it happened. And that's, most memories don't act that way. Most of our memories, fade or we embellish. But my experience is the same. When I remember my experience, it's the same now as it was back then in '83. So it's kind of interesting. But that's a great point, Sabrina, that many, and it's a good way to be able to tell, experiencers that have had these profound experiences, because, it's the same story, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40 years later. I've known some childhood experiencers that they were forced by circumstance, like their parents said, oh, that's just your young mind hallucinating, that's an imaginary scenario that didn't really happen. And so in a way, and those are people of authority to a child, and so then they tend to suppress it. But then it bubbles back up later in life, and suddenly they have these memories that come back up to the surface. They can't stay suppressed forever. And so many childhood experiencers experience it differently than adults, because as a child, they immediately accept it. As adults, we tend to question it, and then children are told to suppress it, whereas adults tend to hide it, So there's these unique differences between a childhood experience and an adult experience. But in the end, the integration is what's really critical for each and every experiencer. And how they do it and how it comes about can sometimes be almost magical. Meeting my mentors who helped me was quite magical in its own way. That we came together very synchronistic. And that's something that I've learned to rely on. When something is synchronistic, it's something to explore. It's the universe kind of providing a signpost, say, hey, pay attention to this.
And with this newfound spirituality, I was really curious when later in life you had a cancer diagnosis.
Yeah.
How did you deal with the diagnosis and what happened afterwards?
I had stage 4 lung cancer, and it metastasized into my spine. It ate away 2.5 bones of my thoracic, and the tumor couldn't support the weight of my spine any longer, and my spine collapsed. And when that incredible pain hit, that's when I was, in the hospital, and they were trying to figure out what was going on. But it was many years. It was in 2000. So I'd had all these years to kind of integrate my experience and have a new spiritual communication with my higher self, with my soul family. And so I had those tools. And another thing that was unique was that in my life review, when we were talking about the life review, how I had seen my potential future, that was one of the scenarios that I had seen. I saw that I was going to have cancer. I also saw that I was going to live beyond it, and that it had a seed of purpose to it. There was a purpose for why I was going to have this cancer. I didn't realize how bad it was going to be, and I didn't really know when it was going to be. But when it happened, I was very aware of this is something that I saw in the life review. It was crystal clear, because I was in this exam room and the nurse came in and I recognized her. I recognized the doctor. I knew exactly what he was going to say before he said it. And so it was like a very, very intense deja vu of everything that was happening. And so I knew that I was going to survive this. But the prognosis was stage 4 lung and bone cancer. And the prognosis was 0.1% of people at that time survived that prognosis. So the medical community, their reality was, we're going to make you as comfortable as possible. We've got morphine and Percocet, and we've got these drugs that will make you comfortable, and you should get your affairs in order. That was their reality. My reality was, I saw this. I also saw I was going to live beyond it. So we're going to treat this. And I'm going to use a combination of traditional and holistic approaches based on my guidance with spirit, and we're going to overcome it. And so that's what we did. Fortunately, at this point in my life, I had become one of the managers in this hospital. And so I was able to pick my care team, and we treated it, even though everyone thought that I was dying and that I didn't have much of a chance to survive. They thought I was in denial, because I felt, I'm going to survive this. No problem, no sweat. I'm going to get past this. But they didn't. They just kind of felt, well, Dave, you're the patient. You have rights. And so if you want to treat it, we can treat it. But they didn't really feel it was to my best interest, because the treatment is very harsh. But then I supplemented it with some holistic approaches to kind of, mediate some of the harshness. And within 6 months, I was cancer-free. And I've been cancer-free. The doctors, they had a hard time accepting, and they wanted to continue to treat me. But once the cancer was gone, once we took the tests and we saw that the cancer was gone, they wanted to continue treatment. And I said, no, we don't need to. And they said, I don't know what you're doing, but just keep doing it.
You mentioned when you saw that having cancer was a possibility in your life review, that there was also a purpose to it. Do you know the purpose, and would you mind sharing?
Yeah, well, purpose is an interesting topic, because we have many, many purposes in life. The cancer itself, the purpose for that was, many times when you go through something, you develop tools on how to deal with it, right? Well, after going through the cancer, I could talk to other cancer patients, and they could hear me because they knew I had gone through what they're going through. And so I was able to be an advocate for cancer patients. And so that was a huge, and also it helped me to develop my own healing practice, because I used a lot of energetic healing on myself during that phase. And then afterwards, friends and family, were like, well, gee, you did that for yourself. Can you do that for others? And so I developed an energetic healing practice as well. So a lot of those things kind of merged together into this purpose, into a purpose that I had to go through the cancer in order to get to the point where I could do all of that, because I needed that time. I needed to learn. When do we search for our divine nature? When do we call out to God? It's when we're at our lowest low most of the time. It's when we're suffering. That's when we want God to help, ease our burden. That is, for me, it was a tough time, but it was also a time where I expanded my awareness of my own divine nature. So it was another spiritual experience in many, many ways. But purpose, a lot of times, we were talking about synchronicity earlier. When synchronicity happens and like you hear something that suddenly someone else is questioning and you have the answer for them, that is kind of like a small little purpose, okay? You just fulfilled a little purpose. But also there's these purposes, like there's a purpose that is humanity-wide. There's a purpose of why can't we connect with our divine nature? Why can't we break through the illusion of separateness? You know, that's a shared purpose for humanity, right? So you have small and large purposes, you know, and we have a lot of, and when I was in the life review and I saw that future and I saw that central corridor, to me, that was the decisions that I had made that I wanted to achieve in life. Those things in the core pathway were what I had agreed to come here for, okay? That's part of the purpose. But the periphery allows us to, if we want to go a little to this side or we want to go a little to that side, it allows us free will to get there in our own way. So it's kind of interesting, you know, purpose is very fluid. It's not so much about what a legacy that we're leaving behind. That's not what purpose is really about. Purpose is more about living within your true nature so that you can be present and you can take the right path at the right time to be there. And most of the time is to be there for others. It's not so much about ourselves. Purpose many times is a part of our service that we provide in life.
One of the things that I found remarkable was your unwavering faith in what you had seen. So you had seen that you were going to live through the cancer, and even though reality by the means of doctors and tests were saying chances are slim, you still had this unwavering faith, which I think is quite remarkable.
I think that also helps when we keep a positive attitude through troubling times. I think that it empowers not only our being, but it fortifies our cellular structure. It fortifies our mind, of course. So positive attitude is incredibly powerful when in any kind of what you may call a negative experience, okay? To have that positive, empowering outlook on life. Now, I saw in my life review that I was going to live beyond it. So for me, that was my reality. I already knew. In fact, while we were going through the cancer, and just as, you know, when the cancer is over, the doctors in the medical profession are like, oh, we got to keep an eye on you because you could relapse, you could come back and all that sort of thing. And I put that aside. It was like, I'm going to live my life. And so my girlfriend at the time, we got married, we started, you know, planning, you know, looking for a house and planning our life. We weren't thinking about how cancer is going to come back and it's going to affect us and it's going to change everything. No, that's not our reality. So a clear vision is also a positive attitude and a clear vision of where you're going to find yourself in the future. What's the future going to look like for you, you know? And so stabilize that vision. Use it as your guidepost. Edgar Cayce talks about creating ideals in life. And ideals are like a guiding star. They're not something you can necessarily achieve. You know, like I want to live my life with peace and I want to live my life, you know, with compassion. Well, we're human. We're not going to always live with peace. We're not always going to live with compassion, but that can be my guiding star. That's the principle I want to live with. I want to live with truth in my life. That's my guiding star. And so, but we're human. We fall down all the time. The secret is not to judge ourselves, but to get back up and to start and keep going down the path, you know, and have that ideal and establish that ideal. Many times we don't bother. You know, we don't bother with an ideal, and so then we wonder why life seems to be so willy-nilly. We're constantly wandering, you know. But to establish a path, establish something that resonates with your heart. What feels right to you? What is it that your soul desires? You know, use that. That could be your guiding principle. That could be your ideal.
I would definitely recommend everybody listening to take a minute and contemplate, what does this mean?
Yeah.
I know this is a bit of sensitive territory, but you've mentioned treating the cancer with both conventional therapy as well as different therapies. And I will put a disclaimer out there that, you know, we're not medical professionals. We're not giving any recommendations, and you should do whatever you feel called to. but I know I can almost see the comment section in front of me, and it almost seems very selfish knowing that you have used other practices to help your disease. It would seem very selfish to not ask if there's anything that people should look into, and from there decide if it's maybe something for them or not.
Yeah, Sabrina, that's absolutely right. What worked for me may not necessarily work for others. So I don't like to make recommendations, but I do share, if you go to my website, Dharma Talks, there's a page there that's, how I dealt with cancer. And it kind of explains the holistic approaches and the attitudes and that I used. But, we were just talking about attitude. Attitude is huge. To have a defeatist attitude is only going to harm you. To have a positive attitude is only going to help you. And so, I don't think you need I don't think you need a medical degree to support that, In fact, it's kind of interesting. There have been a number of studies now that have shown that, especially like with pain management and things like that having a positive attitude can really help with a pain management regime. Myself, I didn't like the way the drugs were affecting me. And so I was very fortunate that I had some spiritual guidance that I relied on. And that's what I really try to recommend to people, is that they use their guidance. What feels right? What feels right for you, and what are you led to? Because many times we're led to what we need. It's kind of funny how that works, but gee, where does that come from? Maybe our, true nature is trying to tell us something. But yeah, when you feel guided or you feel led, then pay attention to that. What does that mean, and how can that work in your treatment? I found that the healthcare professionals were very, very accommodating for me, because I went through radiation and chemo all at the same time. And I would bring in a little portable altar, and I would set it on my bedside table while I was having a treatment. And when they would bring in the chemo infusion bags, I would ask them, could I have that before you hang it and before you stick it in me? Could I have that so that I could just pray over it for a minute, and pray that it serves my highest good? And just a little prayer. And they were very accommodating. They totally supported what I was doing, because I was bringing my spiritual nature into the treatment with me, and allowing myself to be a part of the treatment. They're there to help us. It's our responsibility to heal. So we play a big part in our healing. A lot of times we try to give away our power. We try to give that away to others and have, heal me, Well, it doesn't work that way. We heal ourselves. We are a part of the process. And so I think it's very important to understand that, that we have guidance, to use our own guidance, and to, follow what works, because it's going to be different. It's going to be slightly different for each and every one of us.
And I think when you were talking about mindset, one of the things that came to mind was an aunt of mine. She's, I think, 97, 98 now. And for the past few years, many years, I don't know if 10, but a lot of years, she hasn't been well. She's been bedridden. But she's gone through so many surgeries, and almost everybody says it's very likely that she will not make it out. But her mindset, and it's one of those people that are just relentless in their mindset that she needs to be here, because somehow the people in her life are not able to do anything without her. So she sees herself as this crucial component to everybody else's life, which, granted, in their opinion, is maybe a bit delusional, able to work if she's not here. So her purpose for being here is just so strong. And every year or two, she has another thing that she needs to get surgery for. And as opposed to what you hear from most people her age, that don't want to get surgery, don't want to go to the hospital because they think, well, I'm going to die if I go to the hospital, and then I'd rather just be home. She cannot wait to get those things fixed, because in her mind, she will live forever. So why live forever in a broken body? So it's just amazing that I think so many people in our surrounding look at her and think she's delusional. But I think a lot of the reason of why she's still here today is because she has that mindset that she is essential to everything. And regardless whether it's true or not, one of my aims and goals for myself is to build that mindset within me, to have that strength that no matter what other people would say around me, that I am really focused on the goal and that I am really focused on my beliefs.
Yeah. And also, a lot of times we don't realize that our having that positive mindset affects people around us, because we're not these separate individuals. We are interconnected. And so when people see that you are going through this, this trauma or whatever, disease, trauma, drama, whatever, but you're going through it with your head up and with a positive attitude and with love in your heart, we don't realize how many people we affect in just our presence and when we're being there. The nurses that treated me, the staff that used to know me and the job that I used to hold, but I could no longer do that work anymore, but they were still a part of my friends, my family. It affects a large circle of people. You don't really realize. It's hard to conceptualize how much people see what's going on, And many times we see what's going on and we don't. When somebody is being authentic and they are in a higher level of awareness, people may not understand what they're experiencing when they interact with someone like that, but they feel it and they resonate with it and they can feel the truth behind it. And so it does affect people in a lot of different ways, on different levels that we're just so unaware of most of the time.
How can people connect with your work and with yourself?
Well, if you go to my website, that's the easiest way to connect with just about everything I do. I try to keep that up to date. That's dharmatalks.com, DHARMA. TALK, Dharma Talks, all one word. There you can connect with my social media pages. You can connect with my Contemplative Living podcast. I have past episodes there. Also, my healing practice. If somebody's interested in a white light energy healing, that's the portal to be able to find that as well. But also the books that I've written and things like that are there. But books are available, many outlets. All of that is out there. That's the easiest way. And they can reach out to me, contact me as well. Also in the comments section of this podcast, I will, I'll reply to you, and if people want to reach out, they can reach out to me.
I was 3 years old, and the year was 1993. So we're talking, over 30 years ago, where I had my NDE. I had a condition called pertussis. I suffocated while going to a playground. I lost, all sense of my ability to breathe, and I climbed up into a ladder onto a slide, and my breath was totally gone, suffocated. Then I was, instead of being in my body, I was outside of my body. I was able to become aware of it. I saw all parts of my body just really shutting off, due to the deprivation of oxygen. And then the last part that I was aware of was my own brain, and my brain was, slowly shutting off due to deprivation of oxygen. And then I just felt a large crack within my brain, and that's when, as the saying goes, my brain cracked open, and that's when the spirit realm came in. And so this was quite profound, where I experienced, I think there's many forms of near-death experience. For me, it was more of a mystical, euphoric NDE, where I encountered my own spirit guides, angels. I had awareness of the creative force that is bestowed in every living being, which some will refer to as God, or to me it's just a centerpiece of creation where all of life itself stems from. I was able to see angels. I was aware of previous lifetimes, what I would be doing. I had premonitions of the future, and the near-death experience was certainly profound and had an incredible impact on certainly my worldview and many other people who hear my story or other encounters, certainly.
You were 3 years old at the time, right? So a child is going into this spiritual realm, and what did you think was happening?
Well, I'll start with that point. A child was going to the spirit realm. I think when many people hear my near-death experience, they'll say, "Oh, you were just 3 years old. What did you know?" And I'll say, well, most young kids, if you really look at it, they're more spiritually tuned in to the other side than a lot of adults. They're just coming from the other side. They're coming on the earth plane, so their connection, is many times much stronger and it's a lot more pure. So in many ways, age, the way that we look at it, is much different. Where there's a soul age that many retain in their early years, and a soul recall of who they are, where they come from. So sometimes the younger are the older, and the older are the younger to a degree, from a soul's recollection perspective. But I would say is we are not any of this. When I saw myself going to the spirit realm, I wasn't just this 3-year-old kid. I saw myself as this eternal soul. And so I think that is a bit trippy for a lot of people to think that I am not my age, I am not my gender, I am not, any of these things. I experience these things. But, when you think of, for instance, reincarnation or past lives, you know, if all you are is just this body, then what, do those factor in? And, we've all lived countless lives and many genders and many roles, and this isn't the only act that we're playing. We've had a lot of acts before this, so we're all just, kind of actors on this theater of life within our given roles for given reasons. But certainly I learned that I was not my chronological age. I was able to experience myself, for who I was as an infinite eternal soul. So many other things I know within my second book, The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, I really chronicle, a lot of the lessons. When you think of a ladder, you think of the rungs going up from it from the earth, up into the ethers. And the irony of my name being Jacob, is God's kind of sense of humor, but also the symmetry, how Jacob had a dream where he was running from his life from his brother Esau, and he had the dream of the angels going up and down the ladder in a place called Bethel, which translates to the house of God, the place that I've visited, in the Holy Land. But, I would say is that there's a lot, but we are not what we think. There's a lot of, as my teacher Suzanne Giesemann says, there's a lot of BS or belief systems that get in our own way, where we have this box of the identity, you want to call it the ego, and all that kind of gets in the way. But also, growing up in quite a, dogmatic religious household, I could say that God, it can't be found in the Bible, but God is also bigger than the Bible. And, there's a God that we all know that's not in the powers of, quote unquote, holy people to tell us who God is, what God is about. We all have a connection to the divine. There's no VIP front row seat of those who, maintain a monopolization of it. And so that's kind of what, like Jesus referred to as when he said, the kingdom of heaven in me is in you too. And, certainly, I think we all have that doorway, to connect to it. But there's a lot of spiritual disempowerment and disempowerment in general. From day one, we're taught we are nothing. We, are associated with the chronological age of our body, and we're just said, hey, you're a blank canvas, nothing. Let me imprint my world on you instead of having, imprint, your world on us. And so I think a lot of people have been told, hey, each day you have to run away from that child. You have to grow up. You have to move far away from that little kid. But that little kid is, in many ways, who you are. And, your essence of who you came here. That pure, loving being of joy, of connection, of happiness. And somewhere down the road, that little kid had all these labels put on it, and it started to believe in, all these things. But came here from day one. No one said, oh, that person is too skinny. That person's too fat. That person's not smart enough. They're not making enough money. I don't like their car. But all these things that we've been told are values, cultural myths, so to speak. We've been programmed to believe. So, in a long story short, we are much more than what we think. We are much more beautiful than we think. And there is a higher intelligence governing our life, connected to us, around us at all times in this journey, that we sometimes forget, that we just think that this is all that there is. And that is the greatest ruse that anyone could go around their life with. And so, certainly throughout the course of the dialogue, I hope we could get to more information about the NDE in ways that people could really translate it into their everyday life.
You just touched upon a topic that's really near and dear to my heart, which is that we're being programmed to think we're not enough, we need to drive that car, we need to have this much money, we need to look a certain way. And so often, everything that happens just comes back as there's something wrong with me, right? Most of us just feel at one point or another there's something wrong with how I look, there's something wrong with my abilities, there's something wrong with this and that. But if we think of each other as creations of God, you would agree with me that the creation of God would have to be perfect, right? Yet we do not look at each other, at ourselves, saying that we're perfect. How do you deal with this way of thinking, and how have you moved away from that programming?
Well, it's hard to say, Sabrina, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do our own viewpoints that we have in our life project and carry itself towards the nature of God, or do our own viewpoints of God influence how we view this world? And I think they're both, intertwined. So for instance, most of us, many of us, are conditioned and programmed, to a God that, is all loving, all powerful, and yet, is incredibly chauvinistic and judgmental and, vengeful and jealous. And so there's quite a contradiction with the all-encompassing divine being that we're taught, and some of the fear-based, that's within a lot of structural belief systems. And so, that depiction, in a way, projects how we view ourselves, where there's this conditional orientation towards acceptance, where in order to be something, we must need to do something. In order to be great, we must do great. And what I found is, the dichotomy of religion and spirituality is, spirituality, is really the understanding that you at your core are perfect just as you are. You just have to connect to that being, where religion, is more of a toil base, and it's more of a ritual. There's not ritual, but everything is very kind of measured, and there's many steps, and you have to, it's procedural. Spirituality is really about letting go and tuning into what's inside of you, where religion is really disempowering what's that voice inside of you to tune into someone else's. And so there's a big discrepancy. But to answer your question, I think the viewpoint of reality and of God is pivotal in how we view our world. Albert Einstein, arguably the smartest, the most brilliant man of the modern day history, would say the most important question that governs your life is the universe with you, against you, or an ambivalent place. And if we're able to find ways to reframe, maybe an unfriendly universe, which could be certainly understood on the surface levels for many people's journey, to a place that really has our back, I think, wow, there could be a lot more trust, a lot more belief, and a lot more faith and feeling of love during our journey, despite maybe the absence of it, on the orientation. And so, but yes, the association of beliefs and behaviors are pivotal in any walk of life. But the biggest belief that one could have, I think, is, how they view the nature of reality, and it's what is presented. And I think many people turn towards, concepts like NDEs or spirituality because religion simply has not been able to really satisfy a lot of their practical, circumstances, and they're looking for more solutions to their problems, so to speak.
You mentioned you were able to see previous lifetimes, as well as have premonitions. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I know in my first book, Life After Breath, I, certainly got in a lot more detail, get in a lot more detail about my past lives. But what I would say is, basically, I just saw myself spanning the globe and going over, all parts of Earth, and I saw myself having all these different lifetimes and civilizations. And the most recent one that really sticks out was something that was evidentially read to me, on a couple of occasions before me ever getting public, where I didn't even say a word, and people picked up on this lifetime in which I, constantly saw. But to kind of save the details, and I think this is something that could certainly speak to, a lot of people, these days, and certainly working in the mental health field. To preface, it's certainly, subject to sensitivity, to many, but significant to talk about, and I'll get into that a little bit why. This was a life in which my, back was against the wall. I didn't see any hope. I just remember being in a building, being in a room, and people were around me, and I just decided, to, complete suicide. I had a death by suicide, and we'll get into my word choice in a little bit, why I don't say commit versus complete. But my back was against the wall. I was, some teacher, and I had this kind of hubris, so to speak, and everything just kind of came down, and there was nothing to hold on to. I didn't see anything. But after, I just remembered what's called the life in between lives, which I saw in my NDE, and I just saw that there was pure love, pure acceptance. There was no dogmatic judgment at all, and I obviously am here to tell the tale, so, there wasn't anything to it. But again, I had to work through a lot of that karma within this lifetime, and I certainly think that my near-death experience was an educational point of my soul. As you saw in my NDE, I was completely suffocated of oxygen, wasn't able to breathe, and it was, allegorical for how I felt in my, last lifetime. And, this time I decided to make a different decision, and I had different information at hand that just showed me the power of surrendering to a higher power. And that literally saved my life in that instance. Once I was able to just surrender to that, I just saw that there was a human breath, but then there was a breath of eternity, which we're all created from. And I surrendered to this beautiful creation point of our own existence, which goes beyond, our own finite suffering. And, that allowed me to transcend and to remember, the impermanence of all things, including pain, and how there's a greater reality of love, and really all is well, was well, and will be well, and there certainly is no time. And so it just reminded me how many ways there's a great illusion that we have, but two things could be true at the same time, that it could be very real and visceral here, but having the ability to really go up, the apartment complex and see things from a broader perspective, was able to understand it, at its pure form, which is that it's, it's time bound. It's not permanent. It's just a temporary circumstance. And so that, I certainly think related itself to my NDE, that I had. And certainly there's a lot of lessons that I have and influence a lot of the work that I do today. So that, was certainly something that sticks with me. And subsequently, even after my near-death experience, I kept on having, a lot of these visions of my past life, this particular lifetime that would come to me. And at times it was hard, to kind of see and experience, to relive, that trauma. But it also just reminded me how there's so much more than this individual story, and so much more than, our own, how we see ourselves, and just reminded me that the reality that we are a part of versus just this kind of like weekend trip that we're taking here, in this earth school, so to speak.
I can only imagine knowing that what happened in a previous lifetime is very difficult to process right now, and it's very difficult to process for you. So would you mind speaking about how you integrated that experience?
Yeah, I think we're all here on this earth school for our own different lessons, and the word school carries a trauma in itself for many, because for most of us, school, we'll be honest, was not a learning ground. It was a pressure cooker of regurgitation and deadlines and assignments, and it wasn't environment to really learn too much. It was very adrenaline based and very traumatic, anxiety inducing for a lot of people, and just a lot of information that you'll probably never ever need to apply in a million years, outside of maybe a couple subjects. So I could go down that rabbit hole too. But I think this life, we could view it in many different ways. You could see it as a blessing or a burden, and to me, each moment, each existence that we have, is another opportunity to just be a greater expression of who we are, to remember who we are, and to really evolve, throughout different lifetimes. And I think certainly pain is one of those influential components, whether that's a past life or this lifetime, where we could look back on it, and if we're able to really harness that pain, it could really lead to a lot of growth, and evolution, and change. And so I think, look, when you go into a gym, you don't feel a little bit of resistance, your muscles aren't going to grow. And so within this life, without, any challenge, where, is a possibility of growth. And so there's nothing that says that you need to do anything, but the opportunity to truly transcend, pain is there certainly for many souls who come into this lifetime. And it certainly makes it a much more beautiful experience. We're able to just see that, what's coming, right into me is what I walked out, what I walked into, but what I could come out of it is in my control, and that could allow people to really transform from, feeling, victim placed to finding ways to transcend their experience and being opportunity based within this lifetime. And that invigorates a lot of people to just find ways to skillfully navigate, this road. But certainly, seeing past lives and going through what I went through was traumatic. I mean, it wasn't like I was walking around with a word that said, oh, this is past life or whatever. It was just kind of more of a nuisance than anything else, where I just wanted to live this life, but that disc was kind of skipped to other tracks on the album, and I just wanted this album. But it gave me a sense of purpose to really be doing the work that I'm doing today, which is to allow people to really understand who they are, understand some of those prior chapters, so that they could really expedite, in a way, this lifetime, and they could really know who they are on a deeper level, and really becoming some of the detectives of, who they are, why they're here, and some things that they're here to really learn from. As I always say, messages are repeated until some of those lessons are embraced. And I think for us, we all have our own challenges. No one's immunized from those, but it's really learning through those challenges and understanding what they are, and not taking them at surface level, knowing that they come from a deeper place, that there's an order to all things despite some of the chaos that may present itself on the surface.
Absolutely. And you mentioned past life, you were just talking about it, so I had it also on my list to get deeper into, because I know that you do past life regressions with your clients. Tell me more about what we can get out of past life regressions. And I also want to know, could we get things or know things that we're probably not prepared to deal with or not equipped enough to deal with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's certainly a fair question. Well, I mean, obviously having the near-death experience and having past life memories influenced me to really understand the power of the subconscious mind, which is really understanding we have our conscious mind, the thoughts that we're aware of, at this moment, but then we have a higher subconscious mind, which is kind of like the database of, ourselves, and that database stretches itself beyond just our conscious memories in this lifetime. And, the key is we don't want to live a life that's very, unconscious. We want to live a conscious, aware life, of all things. And so, having the interview just reminded me that there's so much more that we're not privy to, or we're not aware of, on this journey. And we could open that up through really tapping into the subconscious mind, and that gives us a greater sense of orientation and empowerment to who we are, and, getting over that box of our own reality and our own sense of identity. But also for many, evidentially it gives them an understanding that we don't die. When you think about it, when you're able to remember past lives, and, many times, I take my clients to their own time where they, transcended the body and, crossed over, they just have a knowing that knows that they just don't die from having other lives. And so that is, another gift. There's certainly subjective, basis to the regressions, but I think uniformly, I think a lot of clients are able to tap into their own eternity and their own connection to a higher, source within, this journey through the process of letting go. Now, your question of should you be fearful, or how do you know that there should be things that you shouldn't see, is a great power of hypnotherapy. I think we've been hypnotized by hypnosis, by our own media, which has given us a lot of pathological misrepresentations of hypnosis, which is that it's mind controlling. And throughout my own professional practice, I found hypnosis to be quite the opposite, where it's actually really mind liberating, and you could really stop being controlled by a lot of, phobias, carried in this lifetime or other lifetimes, or traumas that are governing your life. So, certainly is mind liberating. And when I do work with my own clients, if there's something that um, they feel too afraid of, or it's not something that they're ready for, they have the power to stop themselves, along with their higher beings. So there's nothing that you really, won't allow yourself to do if you don't want it. You have the ultimate control within the sessions. So that's a real premise that I work for. And, certainly within this life, in other lives, within this life and within past life regression work, you're not being provided anything that you can't handle, long term. And, there's a trusting force in that. And it may feel short term, things could, certainly be, overwhelming, but I think long term, there's a trusting force that we have in past life regression where, yeah, maybe you might have that painful experience, but there's a short term and long term relationship with all of life where maybe there may be a spike in pain, but that's going to the wound, clearing it out, and you're able to really have a long term healing versus just ignoring, that issue and having that govern your lives and having, more pain that's sustainable throughout a lifetime. And so, what I'll say is, whether it's mental health, whether it's, hypnotherapy, it's not the absence of pain. I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding of it, but it's really being able to go there, with compassion, and the tools, to really speak to that point and not, run away from it, so to speak, or, be avoidant of that, circumstance.
Absolutely. And I also tend to think with hypnotherapy and with past lives that I would assume you're going towards those lives or those moments that are important for you to know now. So I'm guessing there's a higher power that knows exactly what you need to work through and what to go towards.
Oh, absolutely. With a lot of my clients, what we do is I give them like an analogy of a hallway, and I said, the room that your soul is most drawn to that speaks to this life, mostly, and they'll go to the doorway and they'll open up the doorway and, things will open up. So, yeah, I mean, it's not, for entertainment purposes. It's not for fantasy. When we do have, and some people come to it for that reason. And, I think that's cool and all, but it's not really what it's about. Past life regression, there's a therapeutic component to it where, there's a resonance, with what you're experiencing and how it translates to this lifetime, and so I always say, if there's not spirituality with practicality, it's just kind of fantasy. So you really want to find ways to translate. You climb the mountain, great. What are you going to do when you climb down? How's that going to translate when you, reach, the bottom of it? So that's with all, experiences that I feel, whether that's, NDEs, OBEs, past life memories, spiritual transformative experience. It's really, the meat on the bone, so to speak, that is most important. It's not just the narratives itself, but yeah. A lot of people will ask, let's say we cross over, right? And let's say, our loved one has a past life. When we cross over, not a past life, our loved one is reincarnated, rather. Are we able to connect with that loved one even if they reincarnated? Which is fascinating. So, for instance, our loved one crosses over, they reincarnate. Are we still able to have a reunion when we leave this world? And the answer is yes. Through a lot of, mediums, evidential mediums that I worked with very closely, including organizations like the Forever Family Foundation, helping parents heal, I found that evidential mediums have given readings, many times throughout their experience where a loved one has reincarnated. But that ability to still connect, even through the medium, through that loved one's soul, is still there. And that just shows you that, and again, this is going to be very thought provocative, but our existence here isn't all that there is, as we know, and there's still a part of us that even lives on the other side. Who we are in this body is just a small fraction of who we are. We're connected, to the other side. So even if we reincarnate, and this is kind of trippy, a part of our soul is still, on the heavenly realm. And, a small fraction of who we are is here in this earthly realm, which is mind-boggling to think, because we're like, I'm in this body, I have this mind, whatever. But, for instance, when we go to sleep and we visit loved ones, or we have these, powerful dreams, like, what is that? It's just kind of like getting into those deeper brainwave states and getting into the ultimate reality. And so when we use the word dream, who's to say that when we dream, that's the dream? Why not maybe that this is really the dream, and that is the ultimate reality? The higher consciousness is the ultimate reality. So, I think life is but a dream, really, in this reality, and it's not all that it appears. So that is something that certainly, something that I personally question myself, but through really researching a lot of this and talking to evidential mediums, it makes perfect sense, that we are, connected over there. And that's what NDEs teach us. It's, when I had my NDE, it wasn't like thousands of miles away. It was a familiar place of home that I always felt connected to. And it was a doorway at the innermost part of my own being. And so we're always connected, to heaven, even when we're on earth. And so we are all literal pieces of heaven, living our temporary lives here on this earth, connected, to over there still while we're here.
And it made me immediately think of soulmates. So a lot of people say that's true and they believe there's somebody for everybody. A lot of people say that's not true. What's your take on soulmates and having twin flames?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept. It's not necessarily my repertoire, so to speak. I'm not like the love guru. But what I would say is there's a lot of past life resonance, with people. Soulmates aren't always, soulmates. Sometimes they could be cellmates, so to speak, where we're just kind of so familiarized with someone from other lifetimes that we continuously reenact, those same scenes that happened. And we're, if you look at this life, we're really gravitated to our own familiars, and sometimes our familiars could be, things that are not good for us. So sometimes soulmates is a misunderstanding where, yes, there's a familiarity, but sometimes that familiarity, isn't necessarily a good thing. So I think an evolved form of a soulmate is more of a kindred soul, where it's just, you feel this connection. But I think sometimes there's a toxicity with soulmates where you have this familiar dynamic with them. Maybe you're not meant to continue this journey with them, but you continue to play out that roles, so to speak. But I think soulmates speak to a lot of past life stuff, and it's not always, the road that you're meant to go down, so to speak. But the concept of twin flames, I think, in a way, we are all whole just as we are, and at the same time, we're part of a greater collective, energies. So I think in any relationship, it's not like two halves make a whole. I don't necessarily see that. I think we are perfect and whole just as we are, and we just experience, someone within our lives who, may help to take our lives to new levels. But on a spiritual perspective, we're perfect just as we are, and there's not like, I don't see that there's a missing piece to kind of fill a void of an empty vacuum. And it's kind of like a lower frequency of spirituality, if you ask me, people who kind of focus on this, because it's very disempowering, and it's almost, the stuff that we run away from to embrace spirituality. But again, we're drawn to our familiars, and again, twin flames is kind of like, hey, you're pathologized and someone else is here to complete you, or hey, you're half and you need that other half. And I think it's a bunch of nonsense, if you ask me. I think we don't have just one particular person that we could be with in this life, or just one chartered person. I think, we could be with many people and find great experiences, with a lot of other people. Some may be, better fits certainly than others on our path. But that's my perspective on things. I'm one out of a billion people, but I don't buy into that stuff. It's not so much my thing,
It's exactly my view as well, where I think it's awesome to have people along for the ride, but I do not believe in the idea that we are not complete unless we have that other half. Like,
there's like this big documentary about these cult leaders who had this cult about like twin flames or something like that. I think it was on like Hulu or Netflix or something like that. And you could see how if someone believes in this and then someone says, hey, I'm an intuitive, I'll find this, you're taking advantage of those who are vulnerable, those who are desperate. And I don't, view, if someone mentions that, I would just say kind of run, because I don't believe in those terms at all. I think at your core, you're beautiful, you're perfect just as you are. And any venture that you delve into is not out of necessity, but rather just an experience on your journey that could, potentially make it, an even better ride. But it's not out of need. It's just an experience, and like we all agree, you're fine and perfect just as you are at your core. There's no one that could complete you. You have the ability to do that. And I met people with the most amazing, beautiful partners and beautiful dynamics as a therapist, and they felt lonely and incomplete. So I don't necessarily think life has to do with anything outside of you, but more of a relationship that you have with your innermost self. And once you're able to really improve that, then everything around you improves. For instance, I have this experience myself. Let's say I could go around and start to hear, music. And if I'm in a really good zone, that song will take on a whole new height. Or if I'm in a good zone, that food will taste much better. And so the same thing with any of, all of life externally. It doesn't begin externally, it starts internally. The better you are, the more aligned you are, the more magnified everything around you is. And also the more empowered you are to not tolerate anything that is not in your greatest and highest good as well too. So I think people need to start looking within, and finding that they are their ultimate soulmates, at the end of the day. They are, and the more connectivity that you have, the more of a soulful life that you have. It's not a person outside yourself that is going to wave the wand and make magic happen.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's not always, but look at these perfect Hollywood celebrity couples who are, probably 30% plastic, but whatever, and they have all their stuff, but they have everything, every box checked off, and, most of them last maybe a couple months to a year, whatever, and you ask yourself why, and it's just, it's not, about the perfect, ideal person. You're that perfect, ideal person, and you could have that perfect, so to speak, partner and feel absolutely miserable, because it's really about the connection within yourself, not as much the person outside of you.
Exactly. Now, coming back to trauma, can we resolve trauma through past life regression? And does it get resolved just by seeing what has happened and what has caused that trauma that we're carrying over? Or do we still need to do work after we've uncovered the cause? And what is that work?
Yeah, I mean, if it would be that easy, if you were just to see, it would be that simple. But many times just seeing it or feeling it is the reason for the trauma itself, And so there's, working as a trauma-informed therapist, I view trauma as this, as I said before, this gashing wound that we have, whether that's in this lifetime or other lifetimes. And it's really by tending to that wound with compassion, with awareness, and the ability to not be defined by that trauma, but to learn how to define it. So as a therapist, sometimes clients could see it and understand the core, issue of it, but there's a lot of post-hypnotic, suggestions that we do with clients so that when those feelings arise, we could really find ways to speak to those feelings and find ways to really ground ourselves in the moment. But really, it's retraining the brain when it views something, so to speak, of the past that thinks it's in the now. And so we have something traumatic, maybe what's with the person. We look at all of life through those lenses, and that person that we see who's not that, let's say perpetrator now becomes it. Life becomes the playground of our traumatic experience, and all that we encounter is viewed from that moment. Once we're able to differentiate, catch ourselves in the moment, and be objective about the moment versus carrying, that moment onto all moments of our life, is when we could have more liberation. And so whether it's mental health, whether that's past life regression, you have to kind of do that work to really have the healing. And with a lot of my clients, I do, things called what's called TFCBT, or trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, where, a big part of it is called narrative therapy. And a client, let's say, will have a storybook. And again, I use that term story because so many times traumatic experiences could define the stories of people's lives. And it's really being able to be empowered and recognizing, what happened, but also having a linearity to the experience. And so we'll start with the clients like, what was your life before that experience? Take me through it. And then when they're ready, we'll take them to kind of really give descriptives of what happened. This takes, a couple sessions really to get them, because it could be an overload on their system when they're able to kind of purge out, this trauma. And then afterwards, we'll have, them write down how they've been able to transcend this and being this hero of their own journey, so to speak, and seeing the possibility that they've worked through this and this has not defined them. And they've been able to show how they've really become, how trauma has been their own superpower, of their journeys. And so, trauma could certainly grip people. It could stifle us. It could, cause paralysis in a way. But when you're able to really see it as a potential superpower, and there's gifts beyond, any challenges that people could find, becomes an ability where people could observe their trauma and find ways to see it through a different lens versus absorbing, the circumstance itself and, having that define your life. And, for some, trauma will always, be there in a way, but if we're able to learn how to live with it, and if we're able to learn how to define it and have it not define us, much like, maybe discuss with grief work, we could really transcend those experiences.
And you just mentioned grief work. What is the grief work that you do with clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's different because, as a psychotherapist, my job is really to meet people where their feet are at. And so I'm not going to say, hey, you're going through grief. I had this near-death experiences, and that bypasses all the stuff that you're going through. And if you listen to my NDE, that's going to change everything. No, not at all. My job is really to take a lot of myself out of the equation and enter where their clients' feet are at. And at times there's a psychoeducation component, to work that you do as a therapist, or you have your own moments of self-disclosure, but it really is not about you. It really is about the clients. But certainly when they're at their level of, the potential openness to, grief could be a great opener for a lot of clients to reevaluate this reality and to really explore, the afterlife and consciousness. And so certainly there's a big associative component with people who do have a belief for a knowing within their afterlife and how they're able to really work through, their own grief. And that's logical. For instance, let's just say, Uncle Joe dies, and your viewpoint of Uncle Joe is that he's 6 feet under the ground. He's dead. That's it. There's nothing left. That could be a very morbid outlook. And I could understand how people could have, tremendous grief and acute grief kind of come up in their lives. But all of a sudden, if there's a possibility that Uncle Joe isn't in that coffin, that he's around us, and that possibility turns into a knowing where you just have undeniable pieces of evidence to validate that, it doesn't bypass your own human part, but allows you to really transcend those emotions and have a different dynamic and a continual relationship with it. But I think the word itself influences our outlooks. I mean, if you look at Webster's dictionary, the word death just means a complete stoppage. And so for many people, that word itself influences our outlooks and behaviors on the afterlife. And, and so I think to answer your question, I think for clients, the human part is pivotal, to really allow yourself to feel. I think when you feel, you can heal, to process what you're going through, to not bypass it, to learn self-compassion. But I think, the capacity for it to really transcend how you look at life is there. For instance, if we're very comfortable on this journey, we're not going to start to reevaluate where we are. But all of a sudden, when discomfort comes to, the surface, it's a segue to really reevaluate our lives. And certainly we could point to different crises of our lives that have taken ourselves out of that comfort zone, and all of a sudden we've been able to find ways to reevaluate the course. And grief is no different, for many people. And there's certainly a lot of, gifts that could come, with loss and gain that could come with loss. But I think people have to really first and foremost honor their feelings and not try to bypass it through, the spiritual connections. So I think the human part is incredibly significant, just as the spiritual part is, at a later point in their, grief journey.
So when I think then about grief, in order to get to those blessings and those gifts that we can get out of grief, is it important to just deal with those feelings and sit with them and accept it? Or are there other components to that almost healing from grief part?
Yeah, I mean, and I certainly encourage, a lot of clients to go to a website. I think it's called grief.org. It's by, started an organization started by the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Foundation. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross worked very closely with near-death experience and people having, share deathbed visions and stuff like that. So she really had a very mystical component to her, but she really started the stages of grief that have been very commonly, there's been a lot of mainstream understanding of those stages, and she's been able to make grief a household name. Certainly loss has happened, throughout the centuries and thousands of years, but now for people to have an understanding of, oh, hey, I'm going through this right now, and that's just a grief response. And if you're able to name it, you could tame it, as they say. But I think really, David Kessler, who now, heads the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation, is someone that I certainly listen to a lot. He speaks of grief, like a river, and David, fortunately lost his son due to overdose, I believe, which is tragic, and that certainly influenced his path and his purpose, so to speak, from pain to purpose in a way. But I think there's no like magic pill to bypass it. But I think grief is kind of like a river, and if you're able to work through it, it could transcend tragedy, into meaning, and purpose in your life, and developing more compassion, potential empathy for the world around you, and more understanding for others on your journey. But certainly for a lot of people, it could develop a lot more meaning, within a certain point of their lives, and they're able to look at life through a deeper lens. But there's no like magic formula in handling grief, but certainly staying with your feelings is important. But I think also that last stage that David Kessler speaks of, where there's 5 stages of grief that we're familiar with, with denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. And those could all have different orders. Usually acceptance is that last phase. But David speaks about the 6th stage of grief, which is meaning. And what does meaning mean? I mean, that could mean a whole plethora of things, but I think for you it's to understand the life that loved one lived. What did they mean to you? How did they influence you? And so many people, and I mentioned this at the grief retreat that I spoke at, they want evidential proof that their loved one goes on. And I think all that is great, having readings, and I've certainly seen the transformative component of that. It is huge, where you have that undeniable piece of evidence that your loved one goes on. But to have that undeniable piece of that loved one going on could also present itself in this life, and that really is finding meaning from that loved one and learning that how we could be the undeniable imprint that our loved one lived, and finding ways to honor that loved one, finding ways to really integrate the impact or the lessons or the essence of that loved one and continuing that loved one's journey on our path in this life. And that's how we could keep that connection forever. As I say, as long as they're in their minds and our hearts, they go on. And I think for us, finding ways to keep our loved ones eternal and finding our ways our loved ones to be a part of our journey is to honor them, is to find the meaning that they had towards us. And that's what I would say. And so for some people, it could be reenacting, things that our loved ones like to do, even if we don't like it. I had someone that I interviewed on my channel whose father was tragically killed in a motor vehicle accident. She later found her dad's bucket list, and it had a list of items in her dad's bucket list that didn't get finished. So she found that list, and she did all these, incredible things like meeting world leaders, skydiving, like all these things that her dad, wanted to do but couldn't do, or and also doing the things that her dad loved to do. So I would just say doing the things that our loved one can't do in this reality is how we keep them alive. even if it's not so much your thing, it makes us closer to our loved ones. And so for myself, for instance, my grandfather loved fishing. I hate fishing, but I've been trying to kind of get by the water, and I have a friend of mine who has a boat and stuff like that, and I do it, and I just makes me feel closer to my grandfather figure. And I think that's hopefully what people can do, is really following through their footsteps and honoring through different rituals or practices or things that our loved ones did over here, to honor them, because as we live over here, we live over there in many ways too. And so some of the things that we are passionate about, and the people that we connect to in this lifetime, we continue over there. So the afterlife, in many ways, is a magnified mirror of this reality.
Beautiful. Now, I also want to take a minute and think that you've had your NDE when you were really young, right? Mm-hmm. So that almost like pushed you into a life of being a bit more open spiritually, of looking for, traumas and dealing with the evidence that you've had of your past lives. So I think you grew up and had a life more influenced by spirituality than most of us would have. And I'm curious how that experience has translated into the work that you do today and the life that you lead today.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a misunderstanding with a lot of near-death experiencers. It's almost kind of like we're these omnipotent beings that know everything, but also there's kind of like a sense of privilege that we have, or near-death experiencers have. And what people forget is, there's an incredible traumatic component, to a near-death experience with what you go through physically. And at least in my case, not all the time, but in my case, suffocating was incredibly traumatic. And, again, there was gifts beyond my trauma where it allowed me to understand layers of empathy and compassion, and being thoughtful and being aware of others' pain from going through it on my own. And that really gave me an influence with the work that I do, is to really be there with others from understanding it, to the fullest extent. But it also led to a lot of complexity, where I was just a young kid and this whole world was kind of looking at it through this kind of prism, and that prism was bursted once I had my near-death experience. And so I always felt quite alone, and in a sense, but also it was just a very complex trajectory where I had to have radical acceptance that I knew that I wasn't the serial kid when I came back from it, but I had to accept that phase, and at a certain point. But it was a struggle, and so it didn't immunize me from certainly a lot of struggle and a lot of pain and suffering post NDE. I think the highs were as high as they get. I mean, you can't get higher than how I felt in many of my moments in my life, but the lows and those kind of feelings were difficult. But those lows made me who I am today, because they allowed me to understand and to be with the ones who suffer the most from being there. So I could have had this near-death experience and just took it to myself and say, wow, that's great. But I decided to take it and see that, hey, it was a moment where God or the spirit realm gave me another chance at this life. And so how could I not try to find God, but how could I try to embody God? So many people are trying to find God. There's not enough embodiment of it. And to me, the embodiment of God is really giving over life, connecting to it yourself and having that ripple effect to those, on your path, and to allow them to be empowered to their own connection. And, I tried my best to give over everything that I had in my near-death experience, as a way of giving back the beautiful gift of life that I was given, in this near-death experience. And so that's what I really try to do within this lifetime. But the near-death experience informs almost everything that I do, in today's journey to lesser degree. It's just, I think there's givers and takers, and yes, to give you need to take, but some people, they just take and take and take, and I think really it's through giving that we really receive. And the ultimate embodiment, of the divine, is to hear, is, as Ram Dass would say, is to love, serve, and remember. And to connect to love, to serve others, and to remember who we are, who you are, who we are as well too.
How can people find you and your work?
Yeah, they could find me, on my website. It's jacoblcooper.com, jacoblcooper.com. And there you could find, my two books, Life After Breath and The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder, as well as on Amazon. I'm also on Facebook, and Instagram, TikTok as well. So it's Jacob Cooper LCSW. I have a podcast as well called The Wisdom of Jacob's Ladder on YouTube and many other platforms. So they could find me through there. And I try my best each day to find anything that catches my eye just to share on the platforms. As I firmly believe that inspiration is the oxygen of our times, and again, that's the oxygen that I was deprived of, and I try to give that over to other people who might feel out of sorts, out of connections. And so, spirit realm, I find, is just kind of like Wi-Fi. It's always there. We just need to connect to it, and then we could find our lives could take on, a whole different trajectory once we certainly connect. For anyone listening to this information, I hope it was helpful. I think people come to near-death experiencers many times because there's something familiar about what we're talking about. Otherwise, people wouldn't tune in the first place. And so I just want to make very clear that you don't have to have an NDE to remember your own eternity. And it's my hope that, listening to myself and many others, that this reminds you of who you are, what you're connected to, but more importantly, the illusion that you are alone, that you are just doing this path on your own, and there's many forces around you. And, surrender, in my case, saved my life. It didn't take away my life, and it didn't take away my power. It allowed me to tune into it. So if you're really going through a tough time, allowing yourself to utilize, obviously, the support from the ground up, their mental health support systems around you, but also, finding ways to really connect to that point of surrendering, to the greater power in you. And you can do that through different, meditation practices. But all, my hope is that pain on the surface reminds you that there's a greater force, inside of you that could work through even the utmost pain, in my case, death. And, I think our own power transcends death, as, hopefully myself and other near-death experiencers are the living embodiment of that understanding. So I thank you for your work, Sabrina, for having me on, and hope some of our information will touch some minds, some hearts who tune into our conversation.